Hello, guys. Welcome to Psyched Minds. If you have not subscribed yet, do subscribe, like, and share, and comments, of course. We are currently reading We the Living by Anne Rand, chapter 11. The revolution had come to a country that had lived 3 years of war. 3 years, and the revolution had broken railroad tracks and scorched fields and blown smokestacks into showers of bricks and sent men to stand in line with their old baskets, waiting at the little trickle of life still dripping from provision centers. Forests stood in silence of snow, but in the cities, woods was a luxury. Kerosene was the only fuel to burn. There was only one device to burn kerosene. The gifts of the revolution were to come, but one and the first had been granted. That which in countless cities, countless stomachs had learned to beg for the fire of their sustenance to keep the fire of their souls, the first badge of a new life, the first ruler of a free country, the Primus. Kira knelt by the table and pumped the handle of the little brass burner that bore the words Genuine Primus, made in Sweden. She watched the thin jet of kerosene filling a cup. Then she struck a match and set fire to the kerosene in the cup and pumped, her eyes very attentive, the fire licking the black tubes with a tongue of soot, sending the odor of kerosene into her nostrils until something hissed in the tubes and a wreath of blue flame sprang up, dense and hissing like blowtorch. She set a pot of millet over the blue flames. Then, kneeling by the fireplace, she gathered tiny locks, damp and slippery in her fingers with an acrid odor of swamp and mildew. She opened the little door of the Burgoyes and stacked the locks inside and stuffed crumpled newspapers over them and struck a match, blowing hard, bending low to the floor, her hair hanging over her eyes, whirls of smoke blowing back at her, rising high to the white ceiling, the crystals of the chandelier sparkling through grey fumes, grey ashes fluttering into her nostrils, catching on her eyelashes. The Burgoyes was a square iron box with long pipes that rose to the ceiling and turned at a straight angle into a hole cut over the fireplace. They had had to install a Burgoyes in the drawing room because they could not afford wood for the fireplace. The logs hissed in the box and through the cracks in the corners. Red flames danced and little whiffs of smoke fluttered once in a while, and the iron walls blazed a dull, overheated red smelling of burnt paint. The new little stuffs were called Burgoyes, for they had been born in the homes of those who could not afford full sized logs to heat the full sized stuffs in their once luxurious homes. Admiral Kovalensky's apartment had 7 rooms, but 4 of them had to be rented long ago. Admiral Kovalensky's had had a partition built across a hall which cut them off from the tenants. Now Leo owned 3 rooms, the bathroom and the front door. The tenants owned 4 rooms, the back door and the kitchen. The Kira cooked on the primus and washed dishes in the bathroom. At times she heard steps and voices behind the partitions and a cat meowing. 3 families lived there, but she never had to meet them. When Leo got up in the morning, he found a table set in the dining room with a snow white cloth and hot tea steaming, and Kira flitting about the table, her cheeks glowing, her eyes laughing, light and uncensored, as if these things had happened all by themselves. From their first day together in her new home, she had stated her ultimatum. When I cook, you're not to see me. When you see me, you're not to know that I have been cooking. She had always known that she was alive. She had never given much thought to the necessity of keeping alive. She found suddenly that that mere fact of keeping alive had grown into a complicated problem which required many hours of effort, the simple keeping alive which she had always haughtily, contemptuously taken for granted. She found she could fight it only by keeping, fiercer than ever, that very contempt, the contempt which once dropped would bring all of life down to the little blue flame of the primer slowly cooking millet for dinner. She found she could sacrifice all the hours the struggle required, if only it would never rise between Leo and her, if only life itself, the life that Leo were kept intact and untouched. Those wasted hours did not count. She would keep silent about them. She kept silent, a hidden spark in her eyes twinkling with the exhilaration of battle. It was a battle, the first blow of a vague, immense battle she could not name but felt, the battle of the two of them, alone, against something huge and nameless, something rising like a tide around the walls of their houses, something in those countless weary steps on the pavements outside, in those lines at the doors of cooperatives, the something that invaded their homes with the primus and the burgoys that held millet and damp logs and the hunger of millions of strange, distorted stomachs against two lives fighting for their right to their future. After breakfast, Leo buttoned his overcoat and asked, "Going to the institute today?" "Yes." "Need changes?" "Change, a little." "Back for dinner?" "Yes." "I'll be back at 6." He went to the university, she went to the institute. She ran, sliding along the frozen sidewalks, laughing at strangers, blowing at a red finger in the hole of her glove, jumping on tramways at full speed, disarming with a smile the husky conductoress who growled, "You ought to be fined, citizen. You will get your legs cut off someday." She fidgeted at the lectures and glanced at her neighbor's wristwatch. When she could find a neighbor with a wristwatch, she was impatient to return home, as she had been when a child in school on her birthdays. She had known that presents awaited her at home. Nothing awaited her there now but the primus and millet, and cabbage to chop for soup. And when Leo returned, a voice that said behind the closed door, "I am home," and she answered indifferently, "I am busy," and laughed soundlessly, rapturously, in the soup steam. After dinner, he brought his book to the Burgoys and she brought hers. He was studying history and philosophy at the Petrograd State University. He also had a job when, after 2 months, he returned to pick up the life his father's execution had broken. He found the job still awaiting him. He was valuable to the Gossis that state publishing house. In the evenings, over a fire crackling in the Burgoys, he translated books from the English, German, and French. He did not like the books. They were novels by foreign authors in which a poor, honest worker was always sent to jail for stealing a loaf of bread to feed the starving mother of his pretty young wife who had been raped by a capitalist and committed suicide thereafter, for which the old powerful capitalist fired her husband from the factory so that their child had to beg on the streets and was run over by the capitalist limousines with sparkling fenders and chauffeurs in uniform. But Leo could do the work at home and it paid well, although when he received his money at the Gossisdat, it was accompanied by the remark, "We have deducted 2.5% as your contribution to the new Red Chemical Society of Proletarian Defense. This is an addition of the 5% deduction for the Red Air Fleet and 3% for the liquidation of illiteracy, and 5% for your social insurance." And when Leo worked, Kira moved soundlessly through the room or sat silently over her drafts and charts and blueprints and never interrupted him. Sometimes they were interrupted by the Upravdom. He came in, his hat on the back of his head, and demanded their share of the house collection for frozen pipes, stuffed chimneys, electric bulbs for the stairs, and someone swiped them again. Leaking roof, broken cellar steps, and the house's voluntary subscription to the Red Air Fleet. When Kira and Leo spoke to each other, their words were brief, impersonal, their indifference exaggerated, their expressionless face guarding a secret they both remembered. But when they were done in the grey and silver bedroom, they laughed together. Their eyes and their lips and their bodies met hungrily. She did not know how many times they awakened in the night, nor where she felt his lips, nor whether his lips hurt her. She heard nothing in the silence but the sound of his breath. She crushed her body against his, then she laughed lazily and hid her face in the curve of her arms and listened to his breath on her neck, on the lashes of her closed eyes. Then she lay still, her teeth in a muscle of his arm, drunk on the smell of his skin. Leo had no relatives in Petrograd. His mother had died before the revolution. He was an only son. His father had stood over vast wheat fields under a blue sky dropping into dark forest far away, and thought that someday these fields and the forest would be laid at the feet of a dark haired, dark eyed boy, and in his heart there was a glow brighter than the sun in the ripe wheat. Admiral Kovalensky seldom appeared at court functions. The deck of a ship felt steadier under his feet than the parquet of the royal palace. But when he appeared, the eyes of stunned, eager, envious faces followed the woman who moved slowly on his arms. His wife, born a countess of an ancient name, had the beauty of centuries gathered, line by line in her perfect body. When she died, Admiral Kovalensky noticed the first grey on his temple. But deep in his heart, in words he dared not utter, he thanked God that death had chosen to take his wife rather than his son. Admiral Kovalensky had but one voice with which he issued commands to his sailors and spoke to his son. Some said he was too kind with his sailors, and some said he was too stern with his son. But he worshipped the boy whose name foreign tutors had changed to Leo from the Russian Lev, and he was helpless before the slightest flicker of a wish in the boy's dark, haughty eyes. The tutors, the servants, the guests looked at Leo as they looked at the statue of Apollo in the admiral's study, with the same reverent hopelessness they felt from the white marble of a distant age. Leo smiled. It was the only order he had to give, the only excuse for any of his orders. When his young friends related in whispers the latest French stories, Leo quoted Spinoza and Nietzsche. He quoted Oscar Wilde at the prim gatherings of his stern aunt's ladies' charity club. He described the superiority of Western culture over that of Russia to the austere, grey haired diplomats, friends of his father, rabid Slavophiles, and he greeted them with an impudent foreign allo. Once, when he went to confession, he made the old priest blush by revelations that at 18, which that venerable dignitary had not learned in his 70 years, resenting the portraits of the Caesar in his father's study and the admiral's unflinching, unreasoning loyalty, Leo attended a secret meeting of young revolutionists. But when an unshaved man made a speech about man's brotherhood and called him comrade, Leo whistled God Save the Caesar and went home. He spent his first night in a woman's bed at the age of 16 when he met her in sparkling drawing rooms. His face remained courteously expressionless when he bent to kiss her hand, and his stately, grey haired husband did not. Her stately, grey haired husband did not suspect what lessons the cold, disdainful beauty he owned was giving to the slender, dark haired boy. Many others followed. The admiral had to interfere once to remind Leo that his own career could be compromised if his son were seen again leaving at dawn the palace of a famous ballerina whose royal patron's name was mentioned in whispers. The revolution found Admiral Kovalensky with black glasses over his unseeing eyes and St. George's ribbon in his lapel. It found Leo Kovalensky with a slow, contemptuous smile and a swift gait, and in his hand a lost whip he had been born to carry. For 2 weeks, Kira had no visitors and paid no visits. Then she called on Irina. Maria Petrovna opened the door and muttered a greeting, confused, frightened, stepping back uncertainly. The family was gathered in the dining room around a newly installed Bergois. Irina jumped up with a glowing smile and kissed her cousin, which she had never done before. Kira, I'm so glad to see you. I thought you didn't want to see any of us anymore. Kira looked at a tall figure that had risen suddenly in a corner of the room. How are you, Uncle Vasily? She smiled. Vasily Ivanovich did not answer. He did not look at her. He turned and left the room. A dark red flushed Irina's cheek and she bit her lips. Maria Petrovna twisted a handkerchief. Little Asya stared at Kira from behind the chair. Kira stood looking at the closed door. Those are nice felt boots you are wearing, Kira, Maria Petrovna muttered, although she had seen them many times. Nice for cold weather, such weather we are having. Yes, said Kira. It's snowing outside. Victor came in, shuffling lazily in bedroom sleepers with a bathrobe thrown over open over his pajamas. It was late afternoon, but his uncombed hair hung over red eyelids swollen by an interrupted sleep. Kira, what a pleasant surprise! He bowed effusively. With outstretched hands, he held her hand and looked into her eyes with a bold, mocking stare as if the two of them shared a secret. We didn't expect you, Kira, but then so many expected things happen these days. So many unexpected things happen these days. He did not apologize for his appearance. His careless swagger seemed to say that such an appearance could not be shocking to her. Well, Kira, it isn't Comrade Taganov after all. Oh, don't look surprised when you hear things at the Institute. However, Comrade Taganov is a useful friend to have. He has such an influential position. It's handy in case you have any friends in jail. Victor, said Irina, you look like a swine and talk it. Go wash your face. When I'll take when I'll take orders from you, my dear sister, you may tell the news to the papers. Children, children, Maria Petrovna sighed helplessly. I have to go, said Kira. I just dropped in on my way to the institute. Oh, Kira, Irina begged. Please don't go. I have to. I have to attend a lecture. Oh, hell, said Irina. They are all afraid to ask you, but I will ask you before you go. What is his name? Leo Kovalensky. Not the son of? Gasped Maria Petrovna. Yes, said Kira. When the door closed after Kira, Vasily Ivanovich came back. Maria Petrovna fumbled nervously for her nail buffer and busied herself with her manicure. Avoiding his eyes, he added a log to the fire in the Burgoyes. He said nothing. Father, what has Kira? Irina began. Irina, the subject is not open to argument. The world is all upside down, said Maria Petrovna and coughed. Victor looked at his father with a bright glance of mutual understanding, but Vasily Ivanovich did not respond. He turned away deliberately. He had been avoiding Victor for many weeks. Asya crouched in a corner behind the buffet, sniveling softly, hopelessly. Asya, come here, Vasily Ivanovich ordered. She waddled towards him slowly, cringing, looking down at the tip of her nose, wiping her nose with her collar. Asya, why are your school's reports as bad as ever? Vasily Ivanovich asked. Asya did not answer and sniffled. What is it that's happened to you again in arithmetic? It's the tractors. The what? The tractors. I didn't know. What didn't you know? The the Selsko Soyuz had 12 tractors and they divided them among 6 poor villages. And how many did each village has? Asya, how much is 12 divided by 6? Asya stared at her nose and sniffled. At your age, Irina was always first in her class, said Vasily Ivanovich bitterly and turned away. Asya ran to hide behind Maria Petrovna's chair. Vasily Ivanovich left the room. Victor followed him to the kitchen. If Vasily Ivanovich heard his steps following, he paid no attention. It was dark in the kitchen. The window pane was broken and the window had been covered with boards. 3 narrow slits of lights added 3 bright stripes to the long cracks of the floor. Vasily Ivanovich's shirts were piled under the sink. He bent slowly and stuffed the shirts into a brass pan and filled the pan with cold water. His back fist closed over a cake of bluish soap. Slowly, awkwardly, he rubbed the collar of a shirt. They had had to let the servant go, and Maria Petrovna was too weak to work. What's the matter, father? Victor asked. Vasily Ivanovich answered without turning. You know it. Victor protested too eagerly. Why, father? I haven't the slightest idea. Have I done anything wrong lately? Did you see that girl? Kira? Yes, why? I thought I could trust in her as in my own soul. But it got her. The revolution got her. And you are next. But father, in my days, a woman's virtue wasn't dragged in the gutter for every passerby. But Kira, I suppose I'm old-fashioned. I was born that way, and that's the way I will die. But all of you young people are rotted before you are ripe. Socialism, communism, Marxism, and to hell with decency. But I, father, you, it will get you in another way. I've been watching. Your friends for the last few weeks have been. You came from a party this morning. But surely you don't object to a little party. Who were the guests? Some charming girls. To be sure, who else? Victor flicked a speck of dust off his sleeve and said, a communist or two? Vasily Ivanovich said nothing. Father, let us be broad minded. A little vodka with them can't hurt me, but it can help me a lot. Vasily Ivanovich's voice was stern as a prophet's. Bubbles gurgled in the cold water under his hands. There are things with which one does not compromise. Victor laughed cheerfully and slipped his arm around the powerful, stooped shoulders. Come on, old man, you and I can understand things together. You wouldn't want me to sit down and fold my hands and surrender because they hold the power, would you? Beat them at their own game. That's what I'm going to do. Diplomacy. That's the best philosophy of our days. It's the century of diplomacy. You can't object to that, can you? But you know me. It can't touch me. It won't get to me. I'm still too much of a gentleman. Vasily Ivanovich turned to him. A crack of light from the boarded window fell across his face. The face was not that of a prophet. The eyes under the heavy white brows were weary, helpless. The smile was timid. The smile was an effort, so were the words. I know it, son. I trust you. I suppose, well, you know best, but these are strange days, and you, well, Irina, you are all I have left. Irina was the first visitor from Kira's old world to her new home. Leo bowed gracefully, diffidently, but Irina looked straight at him, grinned, and said openly, well, I like you, but then I expected to like you, and I hope you like me because I am the only one of your in laws that you will see for a long time. But they will all question me about you, you can be sure. They sat in the shadows of the large drawing room and talked about Rembrandt, whom Irina was studying, and about the new perfume Vava Milovskaya had received from the smuggler, red French perfume, Coties and 50 million rubles a bottle, and Irina had stolen a drop of it on her handkerchief, and Maria Petrovna had cried, smelling it. And about the American movie my Irina had seen, in which women were spangled gowns without sleeves, and there had been a shot of New York at night, real skyscrapers, floors and floors of lighted windows on the black sky, and she had stayed though two shows to see that shot. But it had been so brief, just a flash. She would like to draw New York. She had picked up a book from the table and was sketching busily on the back of its white paper cover, her pencil flashing. When she finished, she threw the book to Kira across the room. Kira looked at the drawing. It was a sketch of Leo standing erect, full figure, naked. Irina, you may show it to him. Leo smiled, his lips drooping, looking at Irina inquisitively. That's the state that fits you best, she explained. And don't tell me that my imagination has flattered you, because it hasn't. Clothes hide nothing from yes, an artist. Any objections? Yes, said Leo. This book belongs to the Gosizdat. Oh well, she tore the cover off swiftly. Tell them you have used the cover for a revolutionary poster. Alone with Kira for a moment before leaving, Irina looked at her earnestly, curiously, almost timidly, and whispered, are you happy? Kira said indifferently, I am happy. Kira seldom spoke of what she thought and more seldom of what she felt. There was a man, however, for whom she made an exception, both exceptions. She made other exceptions from him as well, and wondered dimly why she made them. Communists awakened fear in her, a fear of her own degradation if she associated, talked, or even looked at them. A fear not of their guns, their jails, their secret, watchful eyes, but of something behind their furrowed foreheads, something they had, or perhaps it was something they didn't have, which made her feel as if she were alone in the presence of a beast, its jaws gaping, whom she could never force to understand. But she smiled confidently up to Andrei Taganov and pressed tightly against the wall of an empty auditorium at the Institute. Her eyes radiant, her smile timid and trusting, like a child appealing to a guiding hand, she said, I am happy, Andrei. He had not seen her for so many weeks. He smiled warmly, quietly, looking down into her eager eyes. I've missed you, Kira. I've missed you, Andrei. I've been busy. I didn't want to call on you. I thought you would prefer it if I never called at your house. You see, Then she stopped. She could not tell him. She could not bring him to her new home, to Leo's home. Andre could be dangerous. He was a member of the GPU. He had a duty to fulfill. It was best not to tempt that duty. So she said only, "Yes, Andre. I would rather you never call at my house. I won't, but will you be more regular about your lectures so that I can see you once in a while and hear you say that you are happy? I like to hear that." Andre, have you ever been happy? I've never been unhappy. Is that enough? Well, I always know what I want, and when you know what you want, you go towards it. Sometimes you go very fast, sometimes you only an inch in a year. Perhaps you feel happier when you go fast. I don't know. I've forgotten the difference long ago because it really doesn't matter so long as you move. And you if you want something towards which you can't move, I never did. And if on your way you find a barrier that you don't want to break, I never have. She remembered suddenly. Andre, you haven't even asked me why I am happy. Does it make any difference, so long as you are? He held her two hands, thin and trusting, in his five strong fingers. The first signs of spring in Petrograd were tears and smile. The men smiled, the houses dropped the tears. High on the roofs, the snow was melting grey with city dust like dirty cotton, brittle and shining like wet sugar, and twinkling drops dripped slowly, trickled in little gurgling brooks from the mouths of drain pipes, and across the sidewalks and into the gutters, rocking gently cigarette stubs and sunflower seed shells. Men walked out of the houses and breathed deeply and smiled and did not know why they smiled until they looked up and saw that above the roofs the sky was a feeble, hesitant, incredulous blue, a very pale blue as if a painter had washed the color off his brush in a huge tub of water, and the water held only a drop of a promise. Icy mush crunched under galoshes, and the sun made white sparks in the black rubber toes. Sleigh runners grunted, cutting brown ridges. A voice yelled, "Saccharine, citizens!" Drops tapped the sidewalk steadily, persistently, like a soft, distant machine gun. A voice yelled, "Violet, citizens!" Pavel Syrov brought a pair of new boots. He blinked in the sun down at Comrade Sonia and brought her a hot, shiny cabbage cake from a woman on a corner. She chewed it, smiling. She said, "At 3 o'clock, giving lecture at the Komsomol on our drive on the NEP front. At 5 o'clock, giving talk at the club of the Rapvac on proletarian women and illiteracy. At 7, discussion at the party club on spirit of the collective. Why don't you drop in at 9? Seems I never see you." He said, "Sonia, old pal, can't take up your valuable time. People like you and me have no private life but that of our class duty." Lines stood at the doors of shoe stores. The trade unions were giving out cards for the purchase of galoshes. Maria Petrovna stayed in bed most of the day and watched the sun on the glass of a closed window and hid her handkerchiefs from the sight of all. Comrade Lenin had had a second stroke and had lost his power of speech. Pravada said, "No higher sacrifice to the cause of the proletarian than a leader burning out his will, health, and body in the superhuman effort of the responsibility placed upon his shoulders by the workers and peasants." Victor invited three communist students to his room and they discussed the future of proletarian electrification. He let them out through the back doors to avoid Vasily Ivanovich. England had treacherous designs on the Republic of Workers and Peasants. Teaching of English was prohibited in schools. Arsia had to study German, sniveling over the difference of der, die, das, trying to remember what it was that our German class brothers had done at Rapallo. The boss at the Gozistat said, "The city proletariat is marching to tomorrow in a demonstration of protest against France's policy in the Ruhr. I expect all our employees to take part, Comrade Kovalensky." Leo said, "I will stay in bed. I am having a headache tomorrow." Vasily Ivanovich sold the shade off the lamp in the drawing room. He kept the lamp because it was the last one. In the dark, warm evenings, churches overflowed with bowed heads, incense, and candlelight. Lydia prayed for holy Russia and for the dull fear in her heart. Andrei took Kira to the Mariinsky Theatre and they saw the Tchaikovsky's Sleeping Beauty ballet. He left her at the house on Moika and she took a tramway to her other home. A light snow melted on her face like rain. Leo asked, "How's your communist boyfriend?" She asked, "Have you been lonely?" He brushed the hair off her forehead and looked at her lips. In the deliberate tension of refusing himself a kiss, he answered, "I would like to say no, but you know it's a yes." His warm lips gathered the cold spring's rain of hers. The year 1923, like any other, had a spring. Chapter 12. Kira had waited in line for 3 hours to get the bread at the Institute Cooperative. It was dark when she stepped down from the tramway, her loaf pressed tightly under her arm. At distant corner, lanterns made snakes of light wiggle in black puddles. She walked straight ahead, her shoes splashing through the water, kicking little icicles that clinked like glass. When she turned the corner of her street, a hurrying shadow whistled to her in the darkness. "Hello," called Irina's voice. "And whom do I remind you of when I say that?" "Irina, what are you doing here at this hour?" "Just left your house, waited for you for an hour, had given up hope." "Well, come on back." "No, maybe it's better if I tell you here. I came to tell you something, and, well, maybe Leo won't like it, and he's home, and." Irina hesitated, which was unusual for her. "What is it?" "Kira, how's your fiance?" "How are your fiancés?" "Why, splendid. Why do you ask that?" "How are your finances?" "Why, splendid. Why do you ask that?" "It's just, you see, well, if I am too presumptuous, tell me to shut up. Don't be angry, you know. I've never mentioned them before, but it's your family." Kira peered in the darkness at Irina's worried face. "What about them?" "They are desperate, Kira. Just desperate. I know Aunt Galina would kill me if I knew I told you. But you see, Saccharine man got arrested as a speculator. They sent him to jail for 6 years, and your folks, well, what is there left to do? You know, last week father brought them a pound of millet. If we only could. But you know how things there are with us. Mother so sick, and nothing much left for the Alexandrovsky market but the wallpaper. I don't think they have a thing in the house, your folks. I thought maybe you would like to know." "Here," said Kira. "Take this bread. We don't need it. We will buy some from a private store. Tell them you have found, borrowed, or stolen it, or anything, but don't tell them it's from me." On the following day, Kalina Petrovna rang the bell. Kira was not at home. Leo opened the door and bowed graciously. "I believe it is my mother in law?" he asked. "That's what it would like to be," Galina Petrovna stated. His smile disarmed her. It was infectious. She smiled. When Kira came in, there were tears. Galina Petrovna crushed her in her arms before a word was said and sobbed, "Kira, my child, my dear child, God forgive us our sins. These are hard days. These are very hard days. After all, who are we to judge? Everything's gone to pieces. What difference does it all make if we can just forget and pull the pieces together and God show us the way? We have lost it." When she released Kira and powdered her nose from a little envelope full of potato flour, she muttered, "About that bread, Kira. We didn't use it all. I hid it. I was afraid maybe you need it yourself. I will bring it back if you do. We took only a small slice. Your father was so hungry." "Irina talks too much," said Kira. "We don't need the bread, mother. Don't worry. Keep it." "You must come and see us," said Kalina Petrovna. "Both of you. Let bygones be bygones. Of course, I don't see why you don't get. Oh well, it's your business. Things aren't what they were 10 years ago. You must visit us, Leo. I may call you Leo, may I not? Lydia is so anxious to meet you." One could buy bread in the private stores, but the price made Kira hesitate. "Let's go to a railroad station," she said to Leo. Railroad terminals were the cheapest and most dangerous markets of the city. There were strict rules against private speculators who smuggled food from the villages, but the speculators in ragged overcoat dared long rides on roofs and buffers, miles on foot down slimy mud roads. lice and typhus on trains, and on return, the vigilance of government agents, food slinged into the city in dusty boots, in the linen of vermin infested coats, in bundles of soiled underwear. The starved city awaited every train. After its arrival in the dark side street around the depot, crystal goblets and lace chemisettes were exchanged furtively for hunks of lard and mouldy sacks of flour. Arm in arm, Kira and Leo walked to the Nikolavsky station. Drops tapped the sidewalk. The sun dripped to the sidewalk with every drop. Leo brought a bunch of violets on a corner. He pinned it to Kira's shoulder, a purple tuft, young and fragrant on her old black coat. She smiled happily and kicked an icicle in a puddle, splashing water at the passerby, laughing. The train had arrived. They made their way through an eager crowd that pushed them aside and shoved them forward and stuck elbows into their stomachs and heels on their toes. Soldiers watched the descending passengers, silent, alert, suspicious. A man stepped down from the train. He had a peculiar nose. It was so short and turned up so sharply that his two wide, slanting nostrils were almost vertical. Under the nostrils, there was a white space and a heavy mouth. His stomach shivered like gelatin as he stepped down. His coat seemed too ragged, his boots too dirty. Soldiers seized his arm. They were going to search him. He whined softly. Comrades, brother, so help me God. You're wrong. I'm nothing but a poor peasant, brothers. Nothing but the poorest peasant. Never heard of speculating. But I am a responsible citizen too. I will tell you something. If you let me go, I will tell you something. What can you tell, you son of a bitch? See that woman there? She's a speculator, I know. I will tell you where she's hiding food. I seen her. Strong hands seized the woman. Her arms were like a skeleton's in the soldier's fists. Grey hair hung over her eyes. From under an old hat with a black feather, the shawl held on her sunken chest by an ancient mosaic pin shook silently, convulsively, a thin nervous shudder, like that of a window at the distant sound of an explosion. She moaned, showing three yellow teeth in a dark mouth. Comrades, it's my grandson. I wasn't going to sell. It's for my grandson. Please let me go, comrades. My grandson, he's got the scurvy. He has to eat. Please, comrades, the scurvy. Please. The soldiers dragged her away. Her hat was knocked off. They did not stop to pick it up. Someone stepped on the black feather. The man with the vertical nostrils watched them go. His wide red lips grinned. Then he turned and saw Kira looking at him. He winked mysteriously in understanding and pointed with a jerk of his head to the exit. He went out. Kira and Leo followed him, puzzled. In a dark alley by the station, he looked cautiously, winked again, and opened his coat. The ragged coat had a smooth lining of heavy, expensive fur with the suffocating odor of carnation oil used by all travelers of means as protection against lice on trains. He unfastened some unseen hooks in the depth of the fur. His arms disappeared in the lining and returned with a loaf of bread and a smoked ham. He smiled. His lips and the lower part of his face smiled. The upper part, the short nose, the light narrow eyes, remained strangely immobile as if paralyzed. Here you are, citizen, he said boastfully. Bread, ham, anything you wish. No trouble. We know our business. The next month, Kira was running down the street, fleeting wildly, senselessly from a feeling she could not explain. Just a little party, Kira darling, said Vava Milovskaya over the telephone. Saturday night, shall we say about 10 o'clock? And you will bring Leo Kovalensky, of course. I'm simply dying to meet him. Oh, just 15 or 20 people? And Kira, here's something a little difficult. I'm inviting Lydia, and could you bring a boy for her? You see, I have just so many boys and girls on my list, and they are all in couples, and well, boys are so hard to get nowadays, and well, you know how it is. And I thought maybe you knew someone, anyone. Anyone? Do you care if he's a communist? A communist? How thrilling! Is he a good looking? Certainly bring him. We are going to dance and we are going to have refreshments. Yes, food. Oh, yes. And oh, Kira, I'm asking every guest to bring one log of wood, one apiece, to heat the drawing room. It's so large we couldn't afford. You don't mind. So sweet of you. See you Saturday night. Parties were rare in Petrograd in 1923. It was Kira's first. She decided to invite Andre. She was a little tired of the deception, a little bewildered that it had gone so far. Leo knew all about Andre. Andre knew nothing about Leo. She had told Leo of her friendship. He had not objected. He smiled disdainfully when she spoke of Andre and inquired about her communist boyfriend. Andre knew no one in Kira's circle and no gossip had reached him. He never asked questions, he kept his promise and never called on her. They met at the institute, they talked of mankind and its future and its leaders. They talked of ballet, tramways, and atheism. By a silent agreement, they never spoke of Soviet Russia. It was as if an abyss separated them, but their hands and their spirits were strong enough to clasp over the abyss. The grim lines of his tanned face were like an effigy of a medieval saint. From the age of the Crusades, he had inherited the ruthlessness, the devotion, and also the austere chastity. She could not speak of love to him, she could not think of love in his presence, not because she feared a stern condemnation, but because she feared his sublime indifference. She did not want to conceal it forever. The two men had to meet. She feared that meeting a little. She remembered that one of them was the son of an executed father. The other one, a member of the GPU. Wawa's party was a convenient occasion. The two would meet. She would watch their reactions. Then perhaps she could bring Andre to her house. And if at the party he heard the truth about her, well, she thought, so much the better. Meeting him in the library of the institute, she asked, Andre, would a Burguese party frighten you? Not if you will be there to protect me, if that's an invitation. I will be there, and it is an invitation. Saturday night, Lydia and I are going. And two men, you are one of them. Fine, if Lydia is not too afraid of me. The other one is Leo Kovalensky. Oh, I didn't know his address then. Andre, I didn't ask you, Kira, and it does not matter. Call for us at 9:30 at the house of Moika on Moika. I remember your address. Oh yes, of course. Vava Milovskaya met her guests in the afternoon anteroom. Her smile was radiant, her black eyes and black curls sparkled like the patent leather of the narrow belt around her slim waistline. The delicate patent leather flowers on her shoulder, the latest Soviet fashion, sparkled like her eyes. The guests entered, locks of wood under their arm. A tall, stern maid in black with stiff white apron cap silently received the locks. Kira, Lydia, darling, so glad. How are you? Wawa fluttered. I have heard so much about you, Leo, that I'm really frightened. She acknowledged the introduction, her hand in Leo's. Even Lydia understood Leo's answering glance as to Wawa. She caught her breath and stepped back a little and looked at Kira, but Kira paid no attention. To Andre, Wawa said, So you are a communist? I think that's charming. I've always said that communists were just like other people. The large drawing room had not been heated all winter. The fire had just been lit. A fretful smoke struggled up the chimney, escaping back into the room once in a while. A grey fog hung over the neatly polished mirrors, the freshly dusted tables proudly displaying careful rows of worthless knickknacks. A damp odour of mildewed woods rose to destroy the painful dignity of a room too obviously prepared for guests. The guests sat huddled in corners, shivering under old shawls and sweaters, tense and self conscious, and too carelessly nonchalant in their old best clothes. They kept their arms pressed to their sides to hide the holes in their armpits, elbows motionless on their knees to hide rubbed patches, feet deep under their chairs to hide worn felt boots. They smiled vacantly without purpose, laughed too loudly at nothing in particular, timid and uncomfortable and guiltily conscious of a forbidden purpose, the forgotten purpose of gaiety. They eyed the fireplace wistfully, longing and reluctant to seize upon the best seats by the fire. Everybody was cold and everybody wanted desperately to be gay. The only one whose bright, loud gaiety seemed effortless was Victor. His white stride bounced from group to group, offering the tonic of a ringing voice and a resplendent smile. This way, ladies and gentlemen, move over to this lovely fire. We'll be warm in an instant. Ah, my charming cousins, Kira and Lydia. Delighted, Comrade Taganov. Delighted. Here's a lovely armchair. Lydia, darling, I save it specially for you. Rita, dear, you reminded me of the heroine in the new Cimarron Simirnov novel. Read it. Magnificent. Literature emancipated from outworn conceptions of form. A new woman, the free woman of the future. Comrade Taganov, that project for the electrification of the entire RSFSR is the most stupendous undertaking in the history of mankind. When we consider the amount of electrical power per citizen to be found in our natural resources, wow, these patent leather flowers are the latest word in feminine elegance. I understand that the most famous courtier of Paris has. I quite agree with you, Boris. Chauvineur's pessimism is entirely outmoded in the face of the healthy, practical, philosophical conceptions of the rising proletariat, and no matter what our personal political convictions may be, we must all be objective enough to agree that the proletariat is the ruling class of the future. With perfect assurance, Victor assumed the role of host. Wawa's dark eyes that rested on him every time she fitted through the room sanctioned his ride by long, adoring glances. She flew into the anteroom at every sound of the doorbell, returning with a couple that smiled shyly, rubbing their cold hands, hiding the worn seams of their clothes. The solemn maid followed silently, carrying the locks as if she were serving a dish, and piled them neatly by the fireplace. Kolya Smyatkin, a blonde, chubby young man with a pleasant smile who was filing clerk into the Tobacco Trust, said timidly, "They say, or I heard, I'm afraid, that there's going to be a reduction of staffs in our office next month. Everybody's whispering about it. Maybe I'll get fired this time. Maybe not. Makes you feel sort of uncomfortable." A tall gentleman with a gold pince nez and the intense eyes of an undernourished philosopher said lugubriously, "I have an excellent job in the archives, bread almost every week, only I'm afraid there's a woman after the job, a communist mistress," and someone nudged him and pointed at Henri, who stood by the fireplace smoking. The tall gentleman coughed and looked uncomfortable. Rita Exler was the only woman in the room who smoked. She lay stretched on a davenport, her legs high on its arms, her skirt high above her knees, red bangs low over pale green eyes, painted lips puckered insolently around a cigarette. Many things were whispered about her. Her parent had been killed in the revolution. She had married a commander of the Red Army and divorced him 2 months later. She was homely and used her homeliness with such skillful, audacious emphasis that the most beautiful girls feared her competition. She stretched lazily and said, her voice low, husky, "I've heard something amusing. A boyfriend of mine wrote from Berlin." All eyes turned to her eagerly, reverently, and he tells me that they have cafes in Berlin that are open all night. All night. Elegant, huh? They call them Nach Local. And in a famous, very naughty Nach Local, a famous dancer, Ricky Ray, danced with 16 girls and with nothing on. I mean, positively nothing. So she got arrested, and the next night, she and her girls appeared in a military number. And they wore little chiffon trunks, 2 gold strings crossed over their breast, and huge fur hats. And they were considered dressed. Elegant, huh? She laughed huskily at the odd crowds, but her eyes were on Leo. They had been on Leo ever since she had entered the room. Leo's answer was a straight, mocking glance of understanding that insulted and encouraged Rita at the same time. An anemic girl who sat sulkily in a corner, miserably hiding her feet and heavy felt boots, said with a dull stare, incredulous of her own words, "Abroad. I heard they say they don't have provision cards or cooperatives or anything. You just go into a store just when you feel like it and just buy bread or potatoes or anything, even sugar. Me, I don't believe it myself. And they say you buy your clothes without a trade union order abroad. We have no future," said the philosopher with the gold pince-nez. "We have lost it in the materialistic pursuits. Russia's destiny has ever been of the spirits. Holy Russia has lost her God and her soul. Did you hear about poor Mitya Vesyolkin? He tried to jump off a moving tramway and he fell under, but he was lucky. Just one hand cut off." "The West," said Victor, "has no inner significance. The old civilization is doomed. It is filling new forms with a worn out content that can no longer satisfy anyone. We may suffer hardships, but we are building something new. On our sides, we have the future." "I have a cold," said the anemic girl. Mother got a union order for the galoshes, and there were none my size, and we lost our turn, and we have to wait 3 months, and I got a cold. Vera Borodina had her primus explode on her, and she's blind. And her face, you would think she had been in the war. I brought myself a pair of galoshes in a private store. Kolya Smiatkin said with a touch of pride. And now I'm afraid, but what I was too hasty. What with the reductions of staffs and Wawa, may I add wood to the fire? It's still rather cold. The trouble with these days, said Lydia, is that there's no spiritual enlightenment. People have forgotten the simple faith. We had a reduction of staff last month, but they didn't touch me. I'm socially active. I'm teaching a class of illiterates, free an hour every evening as club duty, and they know I'm a conscientious citizen. I'm vice secretary of our club library, said Kolya Smiatkin. Takes 3 evenings a week and no pay, but that kept me through the last reduction. But this time I'm afraid it's me or another guy. And the other guy, he's vice secretary of 2 libraries. When we have a reduction of staff, said the anemic girl, I'm afraid they are going to throw out all the wives or husbands whose mates have employment. And Misha had such a fine job with the food trust. So we are thinking, I'm afraid we'll have to get divorced. Oh, that's nothing. We can still go on living together. It's being done. When we have a reduction of staffs, said the anemic girl, I'm afraid they are going to throw out all the wives or husbands whose mates had employment. My career is my duty to society, said Victor. I have selected engineering as the profession most needed by our great republic. He threw a glance at the fireplace to make sure that Andre had heard. I'm studying philosophy, said Leo, because it's a science that the proletariat of the RSFSR does not need at all. Some philosophers, said Andre slowly in the midst of a sudden stunned silence, may need the proletariat of the RSFSR. Maybe, said Leo, and maybe I'll escape abroad and sell my services to the biggest exploiter of the millennium and have an affair with his beautiful wife. Without a doubt, said Victor, you will succeed in that. Really, Wawa said hastily. I think it's still cold and we had better dance. Lydia, darling? She threw a cajoling glance at inquiring at Lydia. Lydia sighed with resignation, rose and took the seat at the upright piano. She was the only accomplished musician in the crowd. She had a suspicion about the reason of her popularity at all the rare parties that were still being given. She rubbed her cold fingers and struck the piano keys with ferocious determination. She played John Gray. Historians will write of the Internationale as the great anthem of the revolution, but the cities of the revolution had their own hymn. In days to come, the men of Petrograd will remember those years of hunger and struggle and hope to the convulsive rhythm of John Gray. It was called a foxtrot. It had a tune and a rhythm such as those of the new dances far across the border abroad. It had very foreign lyrics about a very foreign John Gray whose sweetheart Kitty spurned his love for fear of having children, as she told him plainly. Petrograd had known sweeping epidemics of cholera, it had known epidemics of typhus, which were worse. The worst of its epidemics was that of John Gray. Men stood in line at the cooperatives and whistled John Gray at the recreation hour in school. Young couples danced in the big hall and an obliging pupil played John Gray. Men hung on the steps of speeding tramways humming desperately John Gray. Workers' clubs listened attentively to a lecture on Marxism, then relaxed while a comrade showed his skill on a piano out of tune playing John Gray. Its gaiety was sad, its abrupt rhythm was hysterical. Its frivolity was a plea, a moan for that which existed somewhere forever out of reach. Through winter nights, red flags whistled in the snowdrifts, and the city prayed hopelessly with the short, sharp notes of John Gray. Lydia played fiercely. Couples shuffled slowly across the drawing room in an old fashioned two step. Irina, who had no voice, sang the words, half singing, half coughing them out, in a husky moan, as she had heard a German singer do in vaudeville. John Gray was brave and daring. Kitty was very pretty. Wildly, John fell in love with Kitty. Passions hard to restrain. He made his feelings plain. But Cat said no to that. Kira danced in Leo's arm. He whispered, looking down at her. We would dance like this in a place of champagne glasses and spangled gowns and bare arms, a place called Natch Local. She closed her eyes, and the strong body that led her expertly, imperiously, seemed to carry her to that other world she had seen long ago by a dark river that murmured the song of broken glass. Valva undertook to teach Andre to dance and dragged him out into the crowd. He followed obediently, smiling like a tiger that could not hurt a kitten. He was not a bad pupil, she thought. She felt very brave, very daring at the thought that she was actually corrupting a stern communist. She regretted that the corruption could go no further. It was annoying to meet a man in whom her beauty awakened no response, who looked at her with calm, steady eyes, as he looked at Lydia, as he looked at the anemic girl in the felt boots. Lydia played Destiny Waltz. Andre asked Kira to dance. Leo glanced at him with his cold smile, but said nothing and walked away from them. Vava is a good teacher, Kira whispered as Andre whirled her into a crowd. But hold me tighter. Oh, yes, much tighter. Destiny Waltz was slow and soft. It stopped for a breathless second once in a while and swung into rhythm again, slowly rocking a little as if expecting soft, billowing satin skirts to murmur gently in answer, in a ballroom such as did not exist any longer. Kira looked up into a grave face that was smiling half ironically, half shyly. She pressed her head to his breast. Her eyes flashed up at him one swift glance, like a spark, then she jerked her head back. Her tousled hair caught on a button of his coat, and a few strands remained entwined around the button. Andre felt a very soft silk in his arm, and under the silk, a very slender body. He looked down at her open collar and saw a faint shadow parting the flesh. He did not look down again. Leo danced with Rita, their eyes meeting in a silent understanding, her body pressed to his expertly, professionally. Vava whirled, smiling proudly at every couple she passed, her hand resting triumphantly, possessively on Victor's shoulder. Kolya Smiatkin watched Vava timidly, wistfully. He was afraid to ask her for a dance. He was shorter than Vava. He knew that everybody knew of his hopeless, doggish devotion to her and that they laughed at him. He could not help it. The anemic girl's felt boots made the chandelier tremble, its fringe of glass beads ringing softly. Once she stepped on Vava's sparkling patent leather pump. A thoughtful guest added a log to the fire. It hissed and smoked. Someone had not been conscientious and had brought a damp log. At 2 a.m., Vava's mother stuck a timid, pallid face through the crack of a half open door and asked the guest if they would like to have some refreshments. The eager rush to the dining room could cut a waltz short in the middle. In the dining room, a long table stood frozen in a solemn splendor of white and silver crystal sparkling in the blinding light. Delicate forks laid out with formal precision, costly dishes of milky white porcelain offered slices of black bread with a suspicion of butter, slices of dried fish, potato skin to cookies, sauerkraut, and tea with sticky brown candy instead of sugar. Vava's mother smiled hospitably. Please take one of everything. Don't be afraid. That's enough. I've counted them. There is enough. I've counted them. Vava's father sat, beaming broadly, at the head of the table. He was a doctor who specialized in gynecology. He had not been successful before the revolution. After the revolution, two facts had helped his rise. The fact that as a doctor he belonged to the free professions and was not considered an exploiter, and the fact that he performed certain non strictly legal operation. Within a couple of years he had found himself suddenly the most prosperous member of his former circle and of many circles above. He sat, his two fists holding his lapel, leaning back comfortably, his round stomach bulging under a heavy gold chain, costly watch charms tinkling and shuddering with the muscles of his stomach. His narrow eyes disappeared in the thick folds of a white flesh. He smiled warmly at his guest. He was very proud of the rare, enviable position of host, a host who could afford to offer food. He relished the feeling of a patron and benefactor to the children of those who before whom he had bowed in the old days, the children of the industrial magnate Argonov, of Admiral Kovalensky. He made a mental note to donate some more to the Red Air Fleet in the morning. His smile widened when the maid entered sullenly, carrying a silver tray with 6 bottles of rare old wine, a token of gratitude from one of his influential patients. He poured, filling crystal glasses, chuckling amiably. Good old stuff. Real pure stuff. Bet you kids never tasted anything like it. The glasses were passed down the long table from hand to hand. Kira sat between Leo and Andre. Andre raised his glass gravely, steadily like a warrior. Your health, Kira, he said. Leo raised his glass lightly, gracefully, like a diplomat at a foreign bar. Since you are toasted by my class superior, Kira, he said, I will drink to our charming hostess. Wawa answered with a warm, grateful smile. Leo raised his glass to her and drank, looking at Rita. When they returned to the drawing room, the dying fire had to be revived. Lady, whose fingers smelt of incense, Kolya Smiatkin, gave an impersonation of a drunk. Victor told anecdotes, others followed his example. Some of the anecdotes were political, cautious glances were thrown at Andre. Words stopped halfway and Teller stammered, blushing. At 5 a.m., everyone was exhausted, but no one could go home before daylight. It was too dangerous. The city militia was helpless against burglars and hold up men. No citizen dared to cross a street after midnight. Dr. Milovsky and his wife retired, leaving the young guest to await the dawn. The stern, starched maid dragged into the drawing room mattresses borrowed from all the neighbors. The mattresses were lined up against the wall. The maid left. Valva turned out the light. The guests settled down comfortably in couples. Nothing pierced the darkness but a last glow of the fireplace, a few red dots of cigarettes, a few whispers, a few suspicious sounds that were not whispers. The unwritten law of parties dictated that no one should be too curious in these last, weary, most exciting hours of the party. Kira felt Andre's hand on her arm. I think they have a balcony, he whispered. Let's go out. Following him, Kira heard a sigh and something that sounded like a very passionate kiss from the corner where Vava nestled in Victor's arm. It was cold on the balcony. The street lay silent like a tunnel under a wall, slowly turning grey. Frozen puddles looked like splinters of glass panes on the pavement. Windows looked like puddles frozen on the walls. A militia man leaned against a lamp post, a flag bent over the street. The flag did not move, neither did the man. It's funny, said Andre. I never thought I would, but do like dancing. Andre, I'm angry at you. Why? This is the second time that you haven't noticed my best dress. It's beautiful. The door behind them squealed on its rusty hinges. Leo stepped out on the balcony, a cigarette hanging in the corner of his mouth. He asked, Is Kira nationalized state property too? Andre answered slowly, Sometimes I think it would be better for her if she were. Well, until the party passes the proper resolution, said Leo, she isn't. They turned into the warm darkness of the drawing room. Leo drew Kira down to the mattress by his side. He said nothing. She drowsed, her head on his shoulder. Rita moved away with a little shrug. Andre stood by the balcony door, smoking. At 8 a.m., the window curtains were pulled aside. A dull white sky spread over the roofs like soapy water. Wawa muttered goodbyes to her guest at their door. She swayed a little, weary circles under her eyes. One dark lock hanging at the tip of her nose, her lipstick smeared over her chin. The guests divided into groups to work together in clusters as long as possible. In the cold dawn, ice breaking under their feet, Andre took Kira aside for a moment. He pointed at Leo, who was helping Lydia over a puddle a few steps ahead of them. Do you see him often? He asked. The cushion told her that he had not learned the truth. The tone of the cushion that she would not tell him. Lights burned in the windows of barred, padlocked shops. Many doors carried a notice. Comrade burglars, please don't bother. There is nothing inside. And that brings us to the end of chapter 12. We will be reading chapter 13 in the next recording. If there is any comments, any recommendations, any kind of feedback, negative or positive, do reach out to me. And if there is any question at all, you can write in the chat. Thank you for listening. If you have not subscribed yet, do subscribe to the channel. Bye bye for now. Take care. Keep reading. Bye.